delighted to be here. And I understand that what you're here for is to think about how to live a more contemplative life. So what I'm going to do for most of my talk is not to give a lot of extremely practical recipes, which might work or might not, but to try to explain what, from my point of view, is going to be the key point of any practical endeavor of this kind, which is motivation. That is, what do we want that we're not getting from our technology? What is it that we want to be motivated to do? So I thought I'd start with a question. It's a question I don't know the answer to, and as is my habit, if there's a question I don't know the answer to, I tend to hand it over to my students. So you guys in my audience are my students, and I'm not being fake, I really don't know the answer. So consider the following image. This is a contemporary image. This woman, I think, is looking at a screen, computer screen. I'm not sure what the context is. And then let's look at a contrasting image. Take a look at that one. So they're very different images for a variety of reasons. One's a very old painting, one's a contemporary photograph, but they also have certain things in common. There's a woman alone who is engaged in some kind of activity with what we'd call a medium. In this case, it's the Virgin Mary crowned in heaven with a book. In the previous case, it's a lady who we can imagine who she might be. Perhaps she's an executive of some kind, an officer of some important organization, a person who's out there in the world doing something. So I want us to think a little bit about the difference between these two images. One I would say was someone involved in an active activity, that is this woman. And then the other I would say, just hypothetically, is someone in a contemplative activity. Now, one of the differences you might see between them is that one of them is probably thinking about other people. They're thinking about their team members at the company. They're thinking about the presentation that's coming up at the meeting. We can look at her while we're talking about her. That's more polite. So she's thinking about the meeting. She's thinking about her coworkers. She's thinking about what she needs to do for the next step for her project. She's thinking, in a way you'd say, outwardly. Whereas Mary, I think, is thinking inwardly. She's not thinking about what's going to happen next. She's not thinking about coworkers and colleagues. She's not thinking about the next achievement. She's, so to speak, self-contained. Okay, she's inward. So the question I wanted to ask you is this. When you and I actually don't have a smartphone, but I use a laptop, so it's not out of my superior virtue. I'm glued to my laptop instead of my smartphone. But when we're glued to our smartphones, which of these people do we most resemble, if either? What kind of image would we use to describe what we do when we are scrolling through whatever it is, Instagram, Twitter, news, text, emails? Which of these modes are we in, if either? That's a question I don't know the answer to. So I want you guys to, don't put anything in the chat, it'll distract me, but think about it and ask me a question in the second part of this presentation, okay? So I want you to think about that question. Just let that settle. Which of these things are you most like? Or is there some way of thinking that is neither of them that we need to fit the smartphone absorption into? I say that because, and I use these images because a lot of how we live is shaped by how we imagine ourselves, our aspirations, our self-image. And I think images like the first one, the executive lady, they're images which can be motivational for a certain group of people. So that's probably ad copy of some kind I found on the internet somewhere. This is someone who someone wants to be. Maybe you or I want to be this person. Maybe we feel like that person sometimes. these images of the saints, like the image of Mary, they're also meant to be who we want to be. So what kind of aspiration, if any, does being absorbed in one's smartphone do for us? Think about that question. I'm going to come back to you at the end and ask you about it. I want to hear about what you have to say. I don't have an answer to it. I wanted to think of another image, but I couldn't think of one. So I thought I'd just ask you. Okay. So human beings, this is going to be a very broad brush claim, but I'm just going to put it out there. Human beings have two modes of contact with reality. One is knowledge, and the other one is love. Okay? There may be more than that, but those two are broad categories under which a lot of other things fall. So think about, this is a case I like to think about. There's a man he died a couple of decades ago. He was an office worker in Essex in England named John Baker. He loved poetry and was obsessed with peregrine falcons. He followed them around for 10 years on bicycles. He filled out voluminous maps, charts. He cataloged, he counted all the birds that he saw. He counted all the things that they'd killed and eaten. He spent literally years, 10 years, taking in the peregrine falcons in his neighborhood in his spare time. That is on top of his regular office job. So thinking about him for a second, how is he connecting with reality? He has a desire to look at these birds. He wants to see them. He wants to understand them. He wants, as much as he can, to inhabit their way of being, their way of looking at the world. Part of the book that he writes, which I recommend, is fabulous, called The Peregrine, is about how futile that might be. How could we get inside the mind of an animal? But there's a desire to know and to understand something that's different from him. And there's a quest for it. The quest on the bicycle, the quest with the paper, the voluminous cataloging, all of these pursuits, they're all part of his desire to know and to understand. And then there's the love of these birds, his appreciation of them, his admiration of them, their manner of flight, their efficiency at killing other birds, their grace, their strength. So he's in this activity very much exercising both the capacity to know and to love, and he's encountering a certain piece of reality, namely these birds, as best he can. There may be difficulties. If you read the book, you'll wonder, is he really encountering the bird, or is he really on some kind of inward journey about himself? Is he confronting his own tendencies to violence, like the predatory birds? Is he seeking for himself a kind of a strength or a kind of grace like the birds have? But you can't blame him for lack of effort. It's 10 years of relentless attempts to understand this bird and to appreciate it. Here's another example. Now, it's not someone whose life I know about, but Euclid, okay, ancient mathematician. The only thing I know about him is his book, The Elements. It's a collection of mathematical proofs, very comprehensive account of ancient geometry. This is a person who evidently knew, that is, he studied mathematical objects, circles, squares, polygons, parallels, regular solids, numbers, ratios, that all fall under geometry for him. He went for this type of reality. He knew something about it. He encountered it. He understood it. And I think, given the way that it's written, given how beautiful and splendid it is, I think he must have appreciated it. Now think about someone like Augustine, the philosopher and theologian Augustine from the 6th century AD. Augustine wrote, I think I'm going to get this wrong, either 5 or 6 or 7 commentaries on the book of Genesis in the Bible. So what's going on when Augustine is reading the Bible? He's seeking to understand. He's in love with something. He's in love with understanding, in love with knowledge. And he is encountering some kind of reality, whether it's the reality of the text, the reality of creation, if you think that's a reality, the reality of God, if you think that's a reality. So it's another case of someone who is in touch with reality through knowledge and love. Okay. Last example, which is going to add a slightly different dimension, more connected maybe to John Baker. I just recently read the Iliad with some adults. And the poet Homer writes this very long, very elaborate poem about war. Now, war is a very ugly thing in the book and in real life. You see young lives extinguished for no apparent reason, really, because someone's angry, because someone's greedy, because everyone else is doing it. But it's a very beautiful book. And you can learn a lot about what a human being is and about what war is from reading it. So once again, you have a desire to know and an appreciation, a sense of love. Okay, so those are my examples. We have John Baker, Euclid, Augustine, Homer, people who encountered reality with love and in knowledge. So here's a paradox, it seems to me, that I'm going to try to thread my way through. That I think of as being outward behavior. That is, John Baker's looking at birds, Augustine's reading a book, Homer's on the battlefield of some kind. It probably wasn't that battlefield, but some battlefield or other. I think he probably knew pretty well. Euclid is looking at mathematical objects. They're not him exactly. So there's a way in which these people are directed outward. But if you remember earlier, when I was talking about the executive lady, the image of her in her office or whatever it is, conference room, waiting for the presentation, she's also outward. And yet what she's doing looks very different from what they're doing. And the Virgin Mary, who's on the screen, is inward. She's also looking at a book. She's self-contained, but she's looking at a book. She's engaging with something outside of her. So there's a bit of a paradox as to what's inward, what's outward, what's looking out, what's being active in the world, and what's being contemplative, what's being enclosed in oneself, what's reflective, what's serious, and what's a distraction. These words, inward and outward, seem to go in different directions in different contexts. So how are we going to thread that? So here's one possible path. We can think of a certain kind of outwardness as being thin or fake, maybe one, maybe the other, depending on the context. And we can think of certain kinds of outwardness as rich or as real. So here's an example of, or some examples of what I'd call thin or fake outwardness. There's another example from Augustine. It's an example I also like to talk about, like John Baker, the bird watcher, although it's a different kind of example. Actually, it's interesting. It's not that different. It's both two people who like to watch people or things being killed. It's a violent spectacle in both cases. So Augustine's friend, Alypius, who he describes in the Confessions, is a good man, very upright, very self-consciously virtuous and good and worthy. But he becomes obsessed with watching gladiator matches. He goes to gladiator matches again and again. And he's originally drawn, he finds them repulsive in principle. He resists going for weeks beforehand, but his friends drag him there. He goes there with his eyes covered and his ears covered. And the noise of the crowd arouses his curiosity. He uncovers his eyes and he sees, and he can't stop watching. He can't stop watching the Roman gladiator matches where slaves are set to kill one another. And he has to keep going back. He's obsessed. He goes to all the gladiator matches. He goes again and again. So this is an attempt to engage with a reality that I think is in some way thin or fake, but it's hard to understand why. And I want a few more examples to try to flesh it out. So here's another example. I think what Alypius is doing when he watches the gladiators is a bit like wanting to look at a car accident. If you're driving, it happens to all of us. You see an accident on the other side of the road. The desire to look is incredibly intense. You just want to look. If you think about that desire to look, it's not really going to be satisfied by looking. That is, you're going to want to look at those car accidents again and again. You're not really learning anything, okay? Alypius isn't really learning anything gladiator match after gladiator match. He's just engaging his senses. He's engaging his experiences. He's getting thrills out of that kind of engagement that I'm calling thin or superficial, or maybe sometimes fake. I think in these cases, it's not fake, it's just thin. We want a thrilling experience, so to speak, for its own sake, but we're not reaching out to reality. Now, that's a complicated distinction, and you should feel free to press me on it in the question period. But I think there's something in it. That is, I think there's something different between the 10-year inquiry that John Baker takes into the Peregrine Falcons and the a year or two that Alypius spends obsessed with the gladiators. There's a love of knowledge. There's a desire to encounter in the first, and there's some kind of thrill seeking in the second. It's just, you want this experience, you want the thrill, you want to see things happen. So looking at gladiators or rubbernecking at car accidents, to me, in my experience, is the closest analogy I can find to the way that many people engage with social media, including myself when I'm not being disciplined. So think about how many people read political news. You read it for the outrage. That is, you read for the horrible thing that the other guy did that's so outrageous, you just can't believe it. You've got to tell your friends about it. Okay, what's going on when you want these kinds of stories? What's going on when we hunger for these kinds of stories? You wouldn't believe what horrible thing X, Y, or Z just did. Social media is full of this stuff. It's actually impossible almost to avoid it. It's designed by its marketers, I think, to appeal to this part of ourselves. The part of ourselves that if we were ancient Romans, we would watch gladiators. If we were driving where there were a lot of accidents, we would rubberneck at car accidents. But instead, we're online. So we're looking at lurid stories. There's a standard phenomenon on Twitter. Twitter is the main social media I use these days, so it's the one that's on my mind. We've all seen it. The lurid, outrageous news story. You just can't believe it's true. It's retweeted 20 million times. And then a few hours later, there's a little correction circulated. And that little correction says, actually, that just wasn't how it happened. And really, that wasn't the way the story went. And that's retweeted maybe 1,000 times. Okay. That's a sign to us that, in general, our desire for these things is not a desire to understand. It's not a desire for truth. It's not a desire for reality. It's a desire for a certain kind of thrilling experience, like watching gladiators or rubbernecking at car accidents. So here's the interesting thing. I put up the lady at the beginning, the executive lady, because part of what distracts us from encountering reality in search of knowledge and with appreciation, with wonder, with love, part of what keeps us from that is not just lurid distractions. Part of what keeps us from it is what we'd call now, I think, achievement culture. And this requires a bit more explanation. So what happens when my life is organized around achievements? The first thing to notice is that they're limitless. So your first goal is valedictorian of your high school, or National Merit Scholar, or admission to X, Y, or Z school. Then you're in college and it's Phi Beta Kappa. It's summa cum laude. I don't know why it's always classical languages, but it seems to be. It's athletic achievements, academic achievements, internships, admissions into graduate programs, law schools, medical programs, et cetera. But after that, of course, there's more. Where are you going to graduate in your law school class? At the top or at the bottom? Where are you going to get your internships? Where are you going to get your job? Who are you going to clerk for? Then you're working, you're an adult, okay? Then what happens? Well, you need a promotion, you need a raise, you need a prize, you need to be made partner. The achievement is limitless. It never reaches a point of satisfaction. And whatever you have, you might get some satisfaction for a time, a thrill for a time, but it won't last. You'll want more. And no matter how satisfying the last prize was, and I just won a prize, so this is kind of heavy on my mind at the moment. No matter how good it felt, the next prize, if you don't get it, if you really want it and you don't get it, you're going to be devastated. The fact that you won one in the past is not going to console you. You're not going to console yourself by not making partner because you were valedictorian in high school. That's not going to work. So that makes me think that achievement culture, too, is a realm of thrill seeking, a realm of distraction. It's a realm of fantasy. What we're doing is we're engaging with the world, and it's often coexists with, I think what's difficult about it, it can coexist with some very real goods, some very solid good things. You may work as a lawyer and, prosecute some real baddies or get someone innocent out of jail or negotiate a really important contract. You can do real work that really matters when you're in the middle of one of these achievement cycles. But part of the question of how to live is a question of how that becomes your focus. Not the achievements, but the real work, the service, the provision of goods to others. Which I think ultimately, although I might not be able to articulate it that clearly, ultimately I think service to others also ends up being a way of exercising our capacity to know and our capacity to love. Okay, so I'm going to roll together the gladiators, Twitter, rubbernecking at car accidents, and achievement culture with the caveat I made about the possibility of real service. I'm going to roll this all together and call that the world of spectacles. The world of spectacles is at the surface of our experience. It's our default mode. It's what's easiest for us. If we do nothing, that's what's going to happen. That's not because we're bad people. It's not because we're weak. It's not because we're somehow degraded in our essence. Exactly. It's because we're human beings. We're just built this way. Whatever the failing is, whatever the corruption is built into us. It's a fact. It's not an individual failing, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So the world of spectacles is our default mode. It's in a way social, okay? It's not really social because the other people that are involved are your audience. They're the prize givers. They're the approvers. There's the likers and retweeters. They're the people cheering in your ears as you're watching the grotesque spectacle. You're not really encountering those people. They're just egging you on. You're using them in a certain way, and they're using you. So that's the way in which I think the outwardness of the world of spectacle is fake. That is, it's not real engagement. It's fake engagement. And in a way, the world of spectacles is inward. That is, you're in your own thrills. You're in your own experiences. But it isn't really because you're not really facing who you are or what kind of thing you are. So serious inquiry, reflection, contemplation, these are ways of saving us from ourselves, of rescuing ourselves from the world of spectacles. And what they are, serious inquiry, reflection, and contemplation. They're practices of knowledge and love, and they are some among others. So what are the practices of knowledge and love? Let me just sketch it, because this talk isn't quite broad brush enough. I've got to just expand it out a little bit further to cover the whole of human life and what matters in it. Practices of knowledge and love: study, both books, nature, peregrine falcons, mathematical objects; silence, appreciation. That's a pretty simple thing. Any kind of appreciation is an exercise of love. And it implies, if it's sincere, if it's real, and if it's in contact with something, it implies some knowledge. That is, to appreciate something is a response to knowing it and seeing what's good in it. For that reason, if you're a religious person, prayer, of course, is a practice of knowledge and of love. And likewise, all of these things, study, appreciation, prayer, these are all modes, these are all common goals of real human communities, not virtual communities, not crowds of spectators of which you are a member, but real human beings who are engaged in the same kind of activity and with whom you have nitty-gritty encounters that are real, that are true, that are sometimes difficult, but where you know that you are getting to know in a fundamental way another human being or a group of other human beings, where you're committed to some good, some common goal, whether it's study or prayer or just the togetherness of being a family. And you know that requires difficulty, as do all these activities. So I'm going to open up for questions now. So my basic thought is we need to think about how we use technology in order to break out of the world of spectacles, which is our default mode, break out of modes of relating, which can only make us unhappy in the long term, and to form in ourselves practices of knowledge and of love of the kinds that I've suggested. So I'll take any questions now. I don't know quite how the questions will work, but I'll be happy to take them.
You can drop your questions in the tab that's right next to the chat box, and I will be reading them out. And Zena will answer them.
Thank you, Marina.
So let's start off with one question. Is there a way to change the way that we use social media so that we are not consuming it like gladiator matches?
I'm not sure. So I hope so, because I'm on social media and I try to use it in a way that's not gladiator matches. That is, I use it to promote things like contemplation, study, thinking, prayer, worthy and good things, real community. But you can't escape it entirely. So I think one suggestion that's practical is to have a targeted use for it. So you're on there for a reason, and you go on there for that reason, and you remind yourself from time to time when you're going off the track. So that's for instance what I try to do. I remind myself that I'm not there to argue about politics. I'm not there to end years-long friendships. I'm just there to promote my ideas, which are for everyone, and to help them think about things. And so having a targeted goal like that, I think is really helpful.
So Dylan asks as a follow-up, if you have any particular routine that you use to break away from the technology craze, as he describes it.
I actually, in my middle age, I no longer believe in routines. So they work for some people, I believe. I believe they really do. I think the most effective thing is and it takes time and it has to be done over and over again. It's very frustrating. But you need to be motivated. And the way you're motivated is by having some really great activities that are not technological. So, in-person meetings of some kind within the bounds of safety and the law these days, or hiking in the woods, or whatever it is, you have to build force to counter the force that's driving you to the technology. So that's why, in a way, I'm focusing on motivation, is because the more attractive you find alternatives, the more you're going to do them. And you have nature working for you. I mean, these things are actually better. The more you do them, the more you'll like them, and the less the other things will have a hold on you. But it is, remind yourself, it's the default mode. So you're never going to recover from it. You're never going to not be the kind of person that's into social media, probably. There are people like that. I meet them in awe. But so I think being realistic about what you can do, and then also really trying to shore up your motivations with some things that really matter to you, and use community, use your friends, use your family members if they're sympathetic, use other people to build those activities and to make it easier to do them.
So Scott asks if you think that it's possible to have a rich intellectual life that's based online. And I think this is particularly potent in light of the fact that, we're here on an online platform and a lot of students are in online classes right now.
It's so funny, when you first said that question, I thought you said a rich intellectual life based on lying. Oh my God, I've never got this question. No. Based on lying. I think it's not ideal, but I think it can be done. So I think you can, especially if it's small groups. There's actually a number of things that are starting up now, or that have already started up. I have a project, but there's a dozen others of people who get together online and read like great books together. So basically reading groups. I think that that's great. It's better to have one in person if you can. So I think it's always worth trying to find people in your actual community to connect with, just because it will help break the bond between you and the screen. And also because it's just great to be with other human beings. We don't know why, but we all know that by now, having been in quarantine for 6 or 7 or 8 months, we all know that just the presence of other human beings is really important. So don't forget that that's valuable, but also I think people who are too hard on the online interactions might be missing out on some possibilities that are, they're not ideal, but they're better than the alternative. So yes, I think that quite a lot of good can be done online if it's done well.
So Caroline has a question about the extent to which the intellectual life requires an embodied relationship with the world. So she's wondering if the issue with technology is that it is so disembodied. Do you have thoughts on that?
That is a great, great question. It's hard for me. It's a challenging question because I'm not that old, but I'm old enough that I grew up without the internet. And the internet didn't really surface till I was in college, and then it didn't really take off till I was in grad school. It didn't really take off until I was already an adult. So what our intellectual lives were embodied in the sense that they would involve paper books that you held up to your face. But I don't know if that's embodied in the world in the same way that John Baker Chasing Falcons is, or even having conversations with living human beings is. So I think it's a bit of a tough question. I want to say yes, but I'm a little reluctant because of the awkwardness of what reading is. It's an embodied activity. There's paper, there's pages, your eyes are on paper, but it isn't quite as radical. I think from my experience, I want to say it's very different from looking at a screen. It's not exhausting the same way. It leaves your imagination free, and so on. But that's all different from it being embodied. So there seem to be more than one issue here. One is about being an embodied person in the world, which I think is super important, and I think we're all feeling a lack of. But there's another question about technology and learning and books versus screens, which doesn't necessarily overlap with that. It's a different question. I think books are better than screens, but I'm not sure they're more embodied. They're better for some other reason.
No, it's funny that you mentioned that, because we actually did have another question about what your position is on reading a printed book versus a digital book, and whether you think that the value of physical books is mainly in the lack of digital distractions, or if there's something inherently degrading about digital readings.
That sounds like a motivated question. I wish I could actually see you guys and see the face of the person who asked that question. I'd be able to tell if they were a book lover like me that really looked down on digital books, which I think they probably are. So look, here's what I think. I think books are a better way of encountering the written word than Kindles or digital material. I think they're better because of the way they're organized, of the way that you can flip back and forth, of the way your eyes can move on a page. I also think that they're what you mentioned, that they're not tied into your Twitter and your Facebook and your Instagram, so you don't get distracted. There's that same capacity for distraction. But I know a lot of people who read electronically, and it seems to be fine. So I'm reluctant to be too polemical. It's, for me, it's a bit of a matter of taste. To me, it feels a little aesthetic. And I'm a little mistrustful of treating my aesthetic judgments like moral judgments. So I think let's not be too hard on people that read electronic books. But I hope that there will always be a culture of paper books. I think there's a lot that's wonderful about it. A lot of ways of learning that books open up to you that I think it would be lost if the whole thing went down. It would be terrible.
So we have a couple questions relating to the issue of achievement and motivations. So one student asks, how do we maintain the intellectual life while still focusing on having a successful career? Is it possible to balance the two?
I think the answer is yes, it is possible. So I'm very hostile to achievement culture. I say a lot against it, but I'm not actually hostile to achievement or success. Success is great. The difficulty is that it has a kind of addicting effect. So it can take over your life in a way that's bad. So I mentioned this in the talk, but maybe not very clearly. Work is a kind of service. It's a way of providing some good to other people. Am I breaking up? I feel like okay.
No, you're still clear.
Okay, good. It's a way of providing goods to others. So doing that well is a good thing. Quite a lot of successful careers are not focused on service. So one of the matters of discernment is, what concrete good is my work providing the world? And that's really, honestly, as you become an adult, that's one of the hardest questions you can ask and answer, because the answers are going to not turn out to be obvious unless you're doing things which are not considered to be signs of success. If you're a home health aide, no question, what you're doing is really helping other people. But geez, you're not making a lot of money, and you're not sort of moving up in the world. So I think there's a lot to be thought about what counts as a successful career and what meaningful work is. And I think the more meaningful the work, the more grounded you are as a person, the more able you are to put success in its place. And that also permits other kinds of inwardness of the kind that you might need to live an intellectual life. So I think you have to think big. Now, you can have any kind of job officially and carve out a couple hours a day to read. That's fine. But the big issue is really, there are so many careers out there that they're almost designed. It's not that anyone's really designed them this way, but it feels almost designed to distract you endlessly, and to lead you away from real goods. And you have to always be vigilant about that. It's very hard to do, but you've just got to do it.
So Isaac asks, can you be a professional pursuing the life of achievement and still have a life of contemplation like Homer and Augustine? And I'd add, if so, how? Do you have any advice on how to go about doing this?
Isn't that the same question that I just answered? You guys all want everything.
A lot of similar questions.
High achievers, and you want to be deep thinkers. And maybe you can do it, but open yourself up to the possibility that you might have to choose sometime. You might have to choose and do some regular work to try to figure out what really matters to you. And probably you'll encounter crises anyway. Your work will get boring, even though you're really good at it, or you'll hunger for some kind of more meaning or something deeper. So again, you can carve out a couple of hours a day to read, and you can carve out a few hours a week to meet with your friends and talk about them. So there are great poets who had office jobs. Wallace Stevens was an insurance worker, and Frank O'Hara was an art curator at the Modern Museum of Art. It's possible to do all that, but your who you are and what you value can't be taken for granted. Our capacities to delude ourselves about what we really care about are infinite. So you have to be very careful that when you're pursuing achievement, you're doing so in a way that's connected to some real good in the world, some real good for human beings. You have to be aggressively careful about that.
So that seems to me to be an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much, Zena, for speaking tonight and for answering the questions. I found that to be very profitable, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So Glenn, you're welcome to go ahead and start logging on. And while you're doing that, we'll say goodbye to Zena. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you and hearing your wonderful questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Zena. And so if you guys are enjoying what you're hearing tonight's event is just a taste of what ISI offers our student members. If you're tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus and eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom, then we invite you to come learn the timeless principles of liberty with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community that they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. So if you want to get the college education you deserve, I'd encourage you to become a member today at join.isi.org. And you can find the link at the top of the page here. And as your timing is perfect, because here is Dr. Arbery. So I'll just take a second to introduce you if you want to settle in, Dr. Arbery. So Dr. Arbery received his PhD in literature and politics from the University of Dallas and has served as the president of Wyoming Catholic College since 2016. He is teaching a class on epic poetry this semester and is going to talk tonight about the role of epic poetry in the intellectual life and in the world as a whole. And as before, we will have a time for Q&A after Dr. Arbery speaks. So feel free to drop your question in the questions tab throughout. And just to make sure they don't get lost, be sure to switch from the chat box to the Q&A box. Last time we had some questions going to the chat, and it's more likely that they'll disappear into the void if you don't put them into the Q&A box. But with that, Glenn, you're welcome to take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I'm teaching epic poetry this semester. I've just finished the Iliad with my freshmen, and we're starting into the Odyssey. So that's truly a pleasure to do. Poetry is on our very constitution here at Wyoming Catholic College. We have an experiential understanding of what poetry and the poetic mode are all about, with our emphasis on the outdoors, on horsemanship, the physical presence of the real world and the way that it relates to the language that we use about it. So what I want to do tonight as we think about poetry is not so much get into the epics, which would require too much background, I think, for any of us to hold in mind. It's interesting how much the Iliad came up in Zena's talk, and how much Homer and his presence was there. Well, what I want to do is read some poems with you rather than theorize over much about what poetry is or what it does. But I do want to concentrate on three things about poetry. The first is the way that it exceeds ordinary communication. I'll get back to that in a second. The second is the way that it reawakens our language, or as T.S. Eliot puts it, purifies the dialect of the tribe. And the third is the way that it serves as a mode of re-enchantment in the technological age. I think that a lot of us feel that disenchantment, and again, I'll come back to this later, it's almost become a cliche to think about the disenchanted cosmos or the disenchantments of the modern world. But I think we look to poetry in many ways as a kind of salve or answer to that. So to the first, people often say that they just don't understand poetry. And that's always something of a puzzle to me. I can understand saying I don't understand calculus, but poetry doesn't seem that mysterious in its own right, such that it would put people off in a kind of definitive way. In other words, if they approach what looks like a poem, they're immediately turned off and try to flee. This claim has nothing to do with their intelligence, but it does seem to have to do with some experience they've had in the past. At some point, poetry was mystified for them, and they've been made to feel the burden of their own incomprehension. It's as though here are all these words, and none of them mean what they seem to mean. Everything stands for something else, and the rules of this code are very obscure. I think this is most unfortunate. Here at WCC, we're influenced by the work of John Sr., and we start with poetry by memorizing poems from hearing. Our students memorize between 30 and 40 poems during their time here. And they do it from hearing the poem, from learning it that way, rather than starting by analyzing it. And I think that's a particularly good way to approach poetry, because you let it settle into you. You allow the sounds and the meanings of it as you learn the poem to begin to unfold, and you feel the poem in your mind. It has a sort of form that it takes on that you return to and begin to piece out and analyze later after you've already taken in the living poem. The Southern critic and poet Alan Tate calls poetry communion. And Jacques Maritain gets at something similar. This is in his book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, when he calls poetry that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self, which is a kind of divination. Now, I'm aware that sounds like mystification all by itself, but I think that what he's describing is fairly simple. I share the hesitation of Zena Hitz about trying to display technical prowess of any sort here, so bear with me. I'm going to pull up the poem that I want to share. It's by Richard Wilbur, and it is Two Voices in a Meadow. So let me just read this poem first. Say a little about it and then move on. A milkweed, anonymous as cherubs over the crib of God. White seeds are floating out of my burst pod. What power had I before I learned to yield? Shatter me, great wind, I shall possess the field. A stone, as casual as cow dung, under the crib of God. I lie where chance would have me, up to the ears and sod. Why should I move? to move befits a light desire. The sill of heaven would founder, did such as I aspire. So just a couple of things while we still have it here in front of us. What is the intercommunication between the inner being of the things and the inner being of the human self that Wilbur is talking, or Maritanne's talking about here, and that Wilbur seems to embody? The things are pretty simple. A milkweed, which I know you're familiar with, the pods that split open and spill out their seeds, and a stone. The milkweed is over the crib of God, these white seeds floating out, each with its kind of tuft of filaments, and the stone under the crib. The milkweed is all about airiness and lightness and dispersal, and the stone all about solidity and stability. So in both of these, you are getting a sense of what it is that Wilbur's getting at with these two modes of being, this lightness and this stability. The crib of God in both of these is an older word for the manger in English usage. But this poem doesn't feel like a Christmas poem. It's more like a reminder of the incarnation, the crib of God, over it, under it. The milkweed seems to embody something about the dispersal of language, the dispersal of the word. I shall possess the field, literally and figuratively. And then the stone, you think of things like, on this rock I will build my church. That phrase, the sill of heaven, gives a kind of solidity to heaven that you associate with the great grounding truths. So that's about the things. What about the inner being of the human self? I'd say that here in this poem, you notice the personification. Each of these, the milkweed and the stone, has a voice. So it's a matter of knowing, our knowing, through this personification and identification. You might object that stones can't talk, but the poetry provides the voice, which is more or less the inner voice of the creator, you could say. So it's a simple poem. It's not intended to thwart understanding, but to take the simple things, milkweed and stone, and foster this understanding about it, just by looking at the bursting pod of the milkweed and the solidity of the stone. So I think that's what Maritanne means by that intercommunication. Somehow we are taken into the natures of these things through the way that the poetic imagination treats them. My second point has to do with the way that poetry reawakens common language. We had a faculty symposium today here. It was about the relation between natural philosophy and modern science. And I happened last night, and just in thinking about this symposium we were having, to glance at Joe Sachs's introduction to Aristotle's physics. Joe Sachs is a tutor at St. John's, where Zena Hitz also is. And what he said about Aristotle's language struck me as important for understanding poetry. Now here's Sachs talking about Aristotle. He says, the only trouble with ordinary speech for the purposes of philosophy is that it carries too much meaning. We're so accustomed to its use that it automatically carries along all sorts of assumptions about things that we make without being aware of them. Aristotle's genius consists in putting together the most ordinary words in unaccustomed combinations. So I would suggest that the poet also deals with this same phenomenon of the habitual uses of language, which automatically carries along with it thousands of dead metaphors and aphorisms that tend to make perception itself merely habitual and cliched. So when Sachs wants to show that Aristotle uses language in a way that takes some work to understand, he makes his point by by turning to poetry. Let's see if I can get this one up. This is just Joe Sachs's quotation. In the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins' line, "Though worlds of wanwood leave me a lie," that's a quotation from his poem Spring and Fall that our poets memorized. Everything in the words is readily accessible, even though the pieces are combined in unusual ways. So you would ordinarily think about something being piecemeal, and Hopkins calls it leaf meal. Worlds of wanwood leaf me a lie. We recognize this sort of wordplay as a standard device of poetry, which works on us through the ear, the visual imagination, and our feelings. The poet makes us experience a fresh act of imagining and feeling at his direction. And Sachs goes on, as you see, to think what would be lost if you tried to put that same idea into the more ordinary language of prose. So I'm thinking about Sachs and what he's saying about the nature of language here. And Hopkins, how Hopkins reawakens ordinary language. Just a quick, another shared screen here, looking at Hopkins' poem, Pied Beauty. Notice what Hopkins is doing with the language in this poem, which is just fun to get in your head. It's fun to just say this poem. Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of coupled color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzled, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. So you notice the diction, words like brinded, a brinded cow. That's actually used somewhere in Hamlet, I think. But a brinded meaning with stripes or markings on a cow that is mostly brown. But just the way those lines read. For rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. Hopkins is glorying in the possibilities of the language. He's talking about dappled things, and he's giving you the sense of what he means in the sound and the feeling of those lines. So that just reading the poem aloud renews the pleasure of language. It reminds me a little bit of the nonsense poem of Lewis Carroll. Not that this one is nonsense, but you think about Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble and wave. Again, a kind of taking pleasure in the way that you can use language. This leads to my third point, which is that in the technological world, poetry is a mode of reenchantment. Now, what is disenchantment? That's, I guess, the question, what I brought up at the beginning. I think disenchantment comes from a lot of things in the way that we conceive the workings of the modern world. If you go back to Descartes' dualism, so that there's this interiority of the thinking mind, and then everything else out there, including animals, can be understood as essentially mechanical. The body is your own body is a kind of complicated machine. But you lose that sense of the integral nature of body and soul. So also, along with that goes the capacity for intercommunication that Maritain talking about. John Crow Ransom, in his work, Poetry, A Note in Ontology, he's one of the Southern critics also, talks about the chill that came on the English language with Thomas Hobbes. Alan Tate blames Descartes. There's a number of moderns who move away from the poetic mode and the sense of the unity of body and soul that you might blame here. But what happens when we start to lose this capacity for intercommunication? That's the nature of William Wordsworth's lament in his poem, The World is Too Much With Us, one of his great sonnets. And whatever else you say about Wordsworth, who was, in some ways an uneven poet, I think he was one of the great masters of the sonnet in the English language. And this is certainly one of those, when he's thinking about the nature of the disenchantment of the modern world. Notice here that for him, it's mostly economic, I think, in the way that he's conceiving it, but not entirely so. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little do we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Wonderful poem. What Wordsworth makes you do as he's standing there, he's looking at this sea that bears her bosom to the moon. Notice how personification begins to take over, as in the Wilbur poem, as you're trying to understand this nature and make it yours. What he's doing is thinking of the living cosmos that's so present in Homer. When epic poetry once provided this great imaginative framework, my teacher Louise Cowan used to talk about cosmopoesis, which is the way the world as a whole is imagined. You sense that wholeness of the cosmos a number of times in the Iliad, with its height, Olympus, Earth, then Hades and Tartarus far under Hades, the ocean, the stream of ocean, which encloses the whole. Dante, of course, is very much engaged in cosmopoesis, making a whole cosmos and letting you imagine it. And we have, in the modern world, moved away from having that kind of comprehensive poetic view of the way that particulars fit into the larger world. The way resemblances work, though obviously we still feel the resemblances in metaphor. There's a way that they seem to work in the Homeric world to, to knit things together. And elements, things that we think of as lifeless, are understood as living in the Homeric imagination. Fire, for example, and Hephaestus are virtually the same thing. Earth is a goddess. The river Xanthos is a person in the Iliad, rises up and chases Achilles, one of the stranger moments of the poem. But remember in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is swimming after his raft has been wrecked by Poseidon, and he's swimming to shore and he sees this river and prays to the river to take him in, and the river stills its waters. Remember Proteus, as Wordsworth is remembering him here, old shape-shifting Proteus among his seals. So here's Wordsworth speaking to this kind of knowing and trying to find that inner being of things that corresponds to what's inside him and actually gives it a form and a shape. So the sea that bears her bosom, the animate winds that howl at all hours, a way of knowing the inside of other things. So what's happened with what Charles Taylor and others call the disenchanted cosmos is this loss of the living world of the Homeric epics, this sense that things outside us are dead. Charles Taylor has written a lot about this, a Canadian philosopher, and he puts it as a lot of dead stuff out there. That's what disenchantment feels like. He got the term from Max Weber, sociologist, who said that in our daily experience, quoting Weber here, there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means, this is Weber, that the world is disenchanted. So my claim, which is more assertion than argument, I suppose, is that poetry re-enchants the world. Wordsworth is already doing it in this poem about disenchantment. He's standing there looking out at this sea and seeing it bare its bosom to the moon. He's seeing, in imagination at least, in desire, old Proteus rising from the sea. And Triton, you can sort of hear the strains of the horn of Triton as he blows his horn in the way that Wordsworth is imagining it here. I would say that even in poetry of fairly evident disenchantment, like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, there's still a kind of re-enchantment going on, because Eliot gives you a mythical framework to this modern sense of the loss of faith. Poets re-enchant the world with metaphors. Zena Hitz mentioned Wallace Stevens, who worked in his insurance office in Hartford, Connecticut for most of his career, while I think a surprise to his colleagues. He was writing some of the great poetry of the 20th century. But Wallace Stevens' poem, Someone Puts a Pineapple Together, it's just, almost a list of metaphors that awaken your sense of the reality of the pineapple in ways you wouldn't have conceived. But poetry also always draws upon the power and danger of the imagination in what Wordsworth calls the grand elementary principle of pleasure. I think we forget, or we tend to, especially if we're scared of poetry, how much pleasure poetry actually brings. So in concluding my formal remarks, I want to read a poem by Richard Wilbur. It's called A Barred Owl. It's about parents, or maybe grandparents, calming a child awakened at night by the hooting of an owl outside. And the barred owl has a particularly loud hoot. It's pretty scary, particularly if you hear it when you're outdoors. But here's the poem. Let me turn to that. Share the screen. Let's see, here we go. Okay, here's Wilbur's poem. The warping night air, having brought the boom of an owl's voice into her darkened room, we tell the wakened child that all she heard was an odd question from a forest bird, asking of us, if rightly listened to, who cooks for you? And then who cooks for you? Words which can make our terrors bravely clear can also thus domesticate a fear and send a small child back to sleep at night, not listening for the sound of stealthy flight or dreaming of some small thing in a claw borne up to some dark branch and eaten raw. I don't know why I enjoy that so much. Something about that last image is particularly appealing. Both the imagination that domesticates the fear of the child, but also the imagination that can take on the owl there at the end of the poem, that takes some small thing and bears it up to the dark branch and eats it raw. Both of those seem to be characteristics of poetry, and both of them address what seems to me the pleasure of poetry and this, what I'm calling a reenchantment that it brings about. Well, let me pause there and see if there are questions. I'd love to talk out any of these poems more if you have questions about them or more questions in general.
So if a student has never read much poetry, how would you recommend they start? Do you have any tips for the beginner?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question, Miranda.
I'm wondering if you have any tips for a beginner who's never really read much poetry, but wants to learn to engage with it.
Well, I think the first thing to do is just to find start reading poems. I mean, that's the first tip I could give you. And as I say, memorizing poems, if you find some that you like, even if you don't understand them, I think that makes a huge difference in the way that you can begin to appreciate them and understand what they're getting at. Having a whole poem in your head and being able to call it up is one of the real pleasures of that brings poetry home to you, I think.
And you mentioned, I know that's what you guys do at Wyoming Catholic.
Right.
We have a student here also who asks how students can engage with poetry in an academic setting in a way that cultivates a love of poetry rather than stifling it. So would you say that memorizing is the key there, or are there more things that can be done as well?
Well, you know, when I think about how I came to love poetry, it was largely just reading it on my own rather than doing it academically. I mean, the academic setting tends to put poetry in context other than, the pure pleasure of reading poetry. You read a poet because of some importance historically in a particular period, or because of some particular trait of that poet, somebody they represent, Irish poetry or 17th century metaphysical poetry and so on. But I think if you take it up on your own, find somebody who likes it, get some recommendations. I think some of the best reading I did was from people who were just sitting next to me in class and said, one of them said, "Have you ever read James Wright?" And I had never heard of James Wright. So I immediately went and looked him up and read some of his poetry, and it became part of, what moved me from then on in my own reading. I think poetry in particular has to be your own reading. Mastering it academically has never been the real appeal of it to me, and I think probably to anyone who really loves it. It's much more personal than that, and I think much more rewarding.
So Leela asks, how has the way you read poetry changed since when you first started reading poetry? Has it changed?
Has it changed? I think it has. When I first started reading poetry, it was almost as though I were looking for the oracle. I was searching for something that I didn't find in my coursework elsewhere. I would read T.S. Eliot, for example, late into the night. I remember staying up when I was a freshman or a sophomore in college until 4 a.m, reading poetry like that and puzzling it out, sort of listening to the mysteries of it. I think now I've turned much more toward formal poetry. It used to be that I read, whoever was writing anything, but now my taste, I suppose, have changed toward more formal poetry like that of Wilbur or Wordsworth, that has a pretty distinct poetic form to it and an expectation of certain kinds of lines, certain ways that you use the resources of poetry. A great book on this is Paul Fussell's book called Poetic Meter and Poetic Form, which sounds dreary, but it really isn't. It's wonderfully enlightening about how to read poetry.
So a question here from Leisha. She's wondering whether there are any modern poets that you recommend, or whether you think that we should stick to reading more traditional classic poetry.
Well, it depends on where you start with modern. I mean, I read poetry, it's altogether contemporary. But modern in the last century or so, Frost, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, the Alan Tate, John Crow Ransom. I mean, there are dozens of poets writing right now. One that I discovered just last year is a young woman named Tracy Smith, whose poetry I really like. Dana Gioia, of course, is one of contemporary poets. James Matthew Wilson. These are people writing right now whose work is very worthy and I think interesting to read. It's nice to just get a big selection of what's being written right now and find out what appeals to you, what you like about it.
So Roy asks, is all poetry intended to be read aloud? And if so, are there certain ways that poetry should be read?
I think that more traditionally, it's meant to be read aloud. And if you really want to wake it up, particularly say the Hopkins poem, you could look at Pied Beauty on the page and not get that, that intense sort of experience of reading those words in the way that he puts them together. Skies of coupled color as a brinded cow, rose moles all unstippled upon trout that swim. If you let that just stay on the page, you're not getting what it is. Some poems now, however, I think are not so much written to be read aloud. Obviously, there's some like E. Cummings, who is a contemporary of Eliot and Frost, who writes for the page, so that the pattern of the poem on the page and what it does for the eye is more the point than for the ear. But if poetry is not written to be heard, there's something the matter. It ought to be that the sound is the echo to the sense, as Alexander Pope puts it. So I think that's a crucial lack if that's not in fact how poetry is being written.
So Todd's wondering if you ever ask students to write poetry as a means toward greater appreciation themselves. And I would add on to that, do you write any poetry yourself?
I used to write more than I do now. Now I write novels, which are longer than poems, but not as hard, interestingly. Yeah, I have assigned poems. I've assigned sonnets for students to write. And I think that's an excellent exercise. Even if it leads to wailing and gnashing of teeth, it's really helpful to see somebody trying to work in the traditional form of the sonnet to make it work. Like if you noticed Wordsworth's poem, "The World Is Too Much With Us," the first 8 lines kind of set up the problem, and then the last 6 lines answer it, which is the traditional mode of the sonnet. So to get the student to try to do that is very helpful. I think it does lead to a greater appreciation of the poets who do it well, to make it seem natural, make it feel as though this were a form that poet invented just for this poem. That's pretty stunning. And yeah, I think trying to do it yourself is definitely part of it.
So there's been some discussion in the chat box of whether there are any epic poems from America. So do you think there are any American epic poems? If so,
I was thinking about this question earlier today. I mean, there are epics, you can say, in the American tradition. We read Moby Dick as a kind of epic. It's sort of taking the epic tradition over into the novel. But I would highly recommend to those of you who are watching this that you look at some of the work of Frederick Turner. He's a contemporary poet who lives in Dallas, teaches at the University of Texas at Dallas. He's written dozens of books, but he has 3 epic poems, which are all kind of in the science fiction mode. One of them is called The New World, which is about the future of America after it's divided into the various segments that you can already kind of anticipate now, as he could when he wrote it some decades ago. Another one called Genesis, which is about the terraforming of Mars. And the latest one is called Apocalypse. And I think if you look at these, you'll see someone thoroughly conversant with the epic tradition who goes to science fiction because it gives him a kind of liberty with respect to what he can take on in terms of larger themes and, a kind of larger landscape than the immediate historical one. It also gets him, interestingly, outside the kind of strictures of modern disenchantment. So I'd recommend those. I think there have been other attempts. None of them, to me, come to mind right away as successful. This has been one of the problems in the last century or two, is that, as Maritain said of Dante, poets now don't have the luck to have a world that's already kind of constituted imaginatively that they can draw on. So they have to make up a way to conceive of cosmic orders, particularly if they involve God or the gods, in some way that would be characteristic of the ancient epics.
So Teresa asks, why do you think so many people say that they don't get poetry? And she's wondering if it could be a result of an improperly developed modern imagination. You have thoughts on that?
That may be. I think, there was a turn in modern poetry, particularly around the beginning of the 20th century, when the poets embraced difficulty. I think they wanted poetry to be taken as seriously as science was. And so the mode of writing became particularly hard to decipher. And sometimes it really did seem as though the poem were in code. I don't know that the modern imagination per se suffers that much against the ancient imagination, except in ways that, if you're always having to fight off what you feel like is a lack in the culture today, that can certainly be a problem. But I think people bounce off poetry if it seems immediately opaque, if it's just too difficult to understand. I just think that, as Joe Sachs was saying about Aristotle, there are some words here, there's some ways of thinking in language that reward being worked through. So part of learning to love poetry is engaging in that working through that goes on when you really give yourself over to a poem. And by what I mean by that is that you really try to take in everything that you can about the deliberateness of the way that it's written. For example, when Hopkins is writing God's grandeur, he starts off, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. So he puts the word crushed at the beginning of that next line and then puts a period after it so that, you have to pay attention to the placement of the word and the way that the rhythm of the reading of it comes to a complete halt right there on the meaning of crushed. So, reading with the awareness of what the poet is deliberately putting there, I think is a major help.
So one final question, and you're kind of getting at this with your last answer. Roy's wondering, why do the same words in a poem seem to have such deeper meaning than the same words in prose?
Yeah, it depends on the context that the poem establishes, the way that, if, for example, if a rhyme falls onto a word in a poem, you know that the poet is doing that deliberately. So in Wordsworth's poem, The World is Too Much With Us, there are a couple of words that seem highlighted in ways that are very unusual. So the world is too much with us, late and soon. Soon is an adverb. You'd usually pair late with late and early, something like that. But then notice the words that rhyme with soon. We've given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Then later in the poem, for this, for everything, we're out of tune. So you hear the way that the emphasis falls on those words that gives them, a kind of greater importance than they would have simply in a regular sentence or a line of prose.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Arbery, for joining us this evening.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm just glad to do it, and I'm happy to be able to speak to whoever's out there.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who's watching from all over. Really appreciate you guys giving up your evening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of it. Goodbye, everyone.